Hello, everybody. Welcome to episode 2 of our new show, Spotlight. In this weekly show, we shine a spotlight on the best and brightest in tech and financial services to understand what gets people going, what are the key issues, and what's the future of the industry look like, or what does it need to look like. Joining me today is Ashleigh Ainsley, who's co-founder of Colorintech.org. Ashleigh, how's it going, my friend?
Hey, good, thank you. How are you?
Not too bad, thank you. Not too bad. Really good to have you on with us today. Where are you at the moment? Is this a work from home scenario?
I'm actually in Antalya in Turkey,
Wow.
because why not? Like ultimately, I was in Turkey, and it's like, well, if I've got an internet connection, why not work remotely and go to the beach after work?
That is a great plan. I'm very jealous. I'm joining you from sunny Romford, in Essex, so not quite as exotic, but still very very comfortable. But I'm very jealous. As the audience watching, wherever you are in the world, beach or not, do remember to get involved. Leave your questions in the comment sidebar, and we'll be answering them as much as we can today with Ashleigh. But actually, speaking of your good self from Turkey now and enjoying the beach, but tell us more about you. Tell us a little bit about what you do and how you found your way into the tech industry.
Brilliant. So I'm co-founder of an organization called Colorintech. We are a non-profit that works with a number of the world's biggest tech companies. So our partners include Microsoft and Google and Facebook and eBay and many more to try and get more ethnic minorities into the technology industry and ultimately drive diversity, inclusion, and belonging too. How did I get into that? Well, it actually starts from school. So I remember when I discovered the internet. And I'm old enough when I still had to pull out the phone plug and ask my mom to go and use it, and there was that weird dial-up sound. And you know what? I hit the jackpot because one day I had to do my RE homework, and I discovered Wikipedia. And great, like it was a ticket to like A-star grades all the time. And so I've always been a big believer in technology to solve the world's problems, and that continued. So fast forward a few years, I discovered Google Maps, and when I was younger, I couldn't afford to travel, so the next best thing, go and see it on a computer screen. As I grew up, I ended up studying geography at university because I was always interested in the world around me, and just so happened frankly, I went to Oxford, so through the greasy pole of knowing the right people, managed to get myself an interview at Google, and they asked me what was my favorite product. No doubt, what did I write about, talk about? Google Maps, because I'm a big geography nerd, and somehow convince the people there that I should get a job. And that's what happened. And yeah, if I fast forward on that, had a fantastic time at Google, still love the organization, they're still partners of ours, still evangelize about them, but it wasn't as diverse as I wanted it to be. It's not as diverse as they want it to be. And I decided after some time there that I wanted to do something about it. And met a lovely guy who's my co-founder called Deal McKenzie. We were talking about being two black guys in tech, and ultimately decided to do something about it and set up Colorintech. And that's like probably the first 3 chapters of my book condensed into one.
Hey, you got through it in like 4 minutes. That's really impressive, and what a great story! I think I love the natural kind of optimism and hope that a little bit of technology can bring into somebody's lives by opening their eyes to the world beyond sort of the window and what's around them. We are so lucky to be born in a time where there are these tools, and you have that opportunity to do it and kind of get that level up. But I also love that, unfortunately, in that journey as well, you saw an opportunity for more inclusion. And I guess really got inspired to do that. And I guess what I wanted to ask then is, why did it feel important to create an organization that focused on people of color specifically? Was it about creating a safe space? Was it about kind of really just helping organizations with something that maybe they hadn't been strong at? What was the insight?
So if you just go back to, I suppose, the broad sphere, there are lots of protected characteristics in terms of the Equality Act. And back in, I suppose, I would say, the early noughties, there was a lot of movement in terms of, we've seen stuff around like the Me Too movement, and a lot of discussion around gender equality. But ultimately, there wasn't anybody in the UK who was talking authentically to the issues that we had around racial justice, ethnicity, and race in society. And I've worked with a couple of organizations and charities that do some of that stuff. But, tech had this problem. I was there, I was looking around and didn't see anybody who looked like me. And for those who don't know what I look like, I'm a black man. And I certainly didn't see anyone who looked like my mother or my sister. So, for me, it was like, this is an elephant in the room. And ultimately, if I'm not going to talk about it, no one is.
And I think it's so important to at least start that conversation, and especially when we consider intersectionality. I think you mentioned not just people of color, but then you throw in gender as well. The challenges just sort of start to compound. But it's such an important topic, and I guess it's also kind of making it feel less like a challenge and more like something that we can overcome. So when you've worked with Google and KPMG, what have you taken away from those experiences that you now use kind of with those organizations? What does that process kind of look like?
Yeah, so entrepreneurs and social entrepreneurs are naturally the probably most optimistic people you meet, and they kind of have to be. And I'm lucky enough that some of our partners really buy into what we're doing, really support us, and companies like Google literally put their money where their mouth is, and supported us financially as well as through product and brand and all the great things that we do with them. But through my experience working with a range of companies, there are some that if I put it diplomatically, a bit slow on the trend, and I'm constantly banging the drum and pushing them to do more. And I feel from my experience working with kind of big companies, small companies, more progressive ones, and frankly what I'd call laggards, that there is still a lot of work to be done. And I think the interesting thing about kind of like fintech or technology in general and where we are is that really the stuff that's going to make the most ground wave of the thing is innovation. If we think like the stuff which is disrupting, so I used to work for KPMG, does audit, does consulting, does tax, does all this other stuff. Well, taxes ain't going to go away. People always want advice, so there's consultancy. But what about audit? That's a massive size of their business. Like that is ripe for disruption if you think about some of the scandals we've seen, and probably the role that technology can play in whether it's automation or improving the robustness of audit practices. And ultimately, what's going to really shift the behavior of organizations like the KPMGs or the big audit firms is innovation and disruption in their field. They're effectively cash cows, have not gone anywhere, and they're almost regulated into business. So really, if you look at like RegTech and think about where that goes, it's innovation. So who's in charge and who's influential in the innovation and what's going on? Well, that's really where technology comes in. Like the stuff that's going to influence how the future of these companies and these orgs looks like is what happens in the technological disruption. And I want that disruption to be the most equitable disruption that there is. I don't want people to be left out through algorithmic bias or silly decisions, so to speak. I don't want like those things to creep into how we do that. So ultimately, tech is the avenue which is disrupting the world. And ultimately, if we get that as an industry to be an equitable, diverse industry, then it will kind of feed through where we're going with a lot of other companies.
I really like that idea that you've got this momentum of change that's sweeping through the global economy, especially driven by the pandemic. It maybe pulled forward trends by 10 years, but what are we changing it to? And actually, if that's naturally more diverse, then the world starts to resemble the wave of change that's already coming through it. I think that's a super compelling insight. The other thing when you mentioned audit that I thought about is you're probably familiar with ESG standards and some of the work of some of the accounting companies to come up with a standard around ethical, sustainable, and governance, especially the governance side of how their companies are run. And it's starting to impact share prices and accounting standards now. There's both a carrot and a stick. Your share price goes up if you've got a more diverse team, not least because that team is more likely to perform well. That's long since proven and a well-established fact. But also the opposite side, you're just going to get hit by the market for not being diverse, for not being inclusive, for not having good governance. How much do you think things like that are impacting now, or do you think they're still sort of 3 to 5 years out? And is that sort of a realistic thing for these companies?
Yeah, so for example, take the news that we saw L&G put out the other day, which was kind of like they were going to go against or vote against the nominations committee chairperson if the boards didn't have a person of color on them. And like that's going to hit stuff. That's going to hit in the share price. That's going to come up at the AGM. That's going to cause news, and ultimately that's that's the stick, so to speak. We need to be moving these things now. Never did I think at the beginning of 2020 we would see that happen by September of this year. I mean, like, yeah,
Mm.
I've been working in space for like 4 or 5 years, and like the pace of change that we've seen in the last 6 months is probably more than we saw for the first 4 years of doing Colorintech. And ultimately, like, I think that governance thing is big. We kind of saw it in the gender pay gap, that as soon as firms had to start reporting what happened, it became an annual cycle of effectively corporate embarrassment. But out of that embarrassment came strategic efforts to actually do stuff, because people realized we can't keep saying, like, okay, the first year, oh, we realize now we're not paying women equitably. We can't keep saying that. We need to actually do something about it. And that's where the strategy comes from. There's been a lot of talk maybe about an ethnicity pay gap coming along as well. But, you know, these kind of governance things give that carrot in order to, you know, give them that. Because I think the stick is clear. Like, one, it's better business, but two, also, like, you know, if we take so many examples that we've seen in press and PR come out where companies just get stuff badly wrong, you're like, what does that cost in terms of money, time, brand, PR, talent, brand, you name it, you name it.
There are so many impacts, and I think that sunlight is definitely the best disinfectant in terms of transparency in how you're performing. And you mentioned 2020. I want to ask, you know, what you've really observed through this year from the companies you work with and the work you do, because my goodness, it's been quite the year, for not least for the pandemic, but the Black Lives Matter movement and the unfortunate incidents we've seen in the US. Like, what are your perspectives on 2020?
I mean, if I went through the first 3 chapters of my book in my introduction, then this is going to be a whole book.
Yeah.
Like, 2020 has just been an absolute roller coaster of a year. I mean, you know, who would have thought at the very beginning of it, and maybe we should have thought it, that we would be in the midst of a global pandemic, and the influence that has had on the world and the economy. Certainly in my sphere, that has, as you mentioned, accelerated the pace of one technological change. Just look at the share price of stuff like Zoom. Like, great if you're an investor. Like, do you know what I mean? And actually just tech stocks in general. I mean, the growth in those have been actually outstanding. And you know, frankly, looking forwards, I don't see many reasons why the world would wean itself off of technology anytime soon. So, you know, I think that's one thing. I think probably the second thing, which I'd say is kind of obviously well, from a talent perspective, I think if you talk to every founder, every CEO, like, probably one of the things that they're concerned the most about is how they're going to get the best talent. How do they motivate, keep, retain, grow, find the best talent? And that's actually probably the biggest driver of business success. You can have a great product, but if you can't find the right people to sell it, fix it, build it, it ain't going anywhere. And, you know, big, small company, they all have the same issues when it comes to talent. And now the talent marketplace has really shifted. I mean, we've seen some of the big companies think about, well, actually, do we need to just be confined to hiring people within an hour of the office? Like, why not? Like, also, do we need to pay them if they're not paid? You know, to take San Francisco, do we need to pay them a San Francisco wage if they're not in San Francisco? So what does that mean for talent, and what does that mean for benefits? Like, no more free food in the office if, well, you're not in the office anymore. But are employees going to pay for your lunch every day? Probably not. But the data that we've seen is people are working longer hours than they've ever worked before because they can work from home. So there's so many implications to, like, what's happening in 2020, and that's just COVID. Let alone, obviously, we've seen so much stuff with the Black Lives Matter movement. You know, from our perspective as an organization, I've never been so in demand. And it's not just me, obviously there's a team, but it's in that sense it's good because there's now consciousness. And as I said, I've mentioned some companies which are actually, you know, doing many things about it. I saw TikTok put out a press release the other day, and, you know, they're not just doing this today or tomorrow. You know, they're doing sustained strategic efforts around this. I did not think that I would see that happening in the midst of a global pandemic. And that's just been transformational.
It's phenomenal, isn't it, to see the genuine level of commitment that some of these organizations are able to bring to it and muster, and that's an encouraging sign. But again, it's part of the puzzle. It's also the products they produce, and you've talked before about building products inclusively. And this was a question from Bianca, who's watching. So do send in your questions if you're watching. of course, obviously, like facial recognition. There are experiences that we still just don't know or understand enough to build inclusively when it comes to financial services and fintech. What are your sort of key lessons for any business when building products to be able to do so inclusively?
Um, Really, so there's always a tension, and I've worked in startups, so I know there's a tension to ship, to fix the bugs, and to grow, and often those things, have that tension. It's kind of like the product team would much rather maybe take some more time before they ship stuff out. Your client team definitely doesn't want it shipped out too early because they end up firefighting on the bugs. But you need to grow, and ultimately what we end up seeing is actually where people get that balance wrong, they end up shipping bad products, and that can happen within technology. But that also has a cost. It has a cost when we think about the relation of, okay, well, now we've got to go and fix that while it's in production. That is time, energy, effort, and that's bad. Also, what happens on the Twitter sphere? Take Twitter as an example. They recently released a feature about voice notes on Twitter, and people be like, "Oh, that makes sense," until you realize about 500 million people in the world don't necessarily use audio technology in the way that the most able people can do so. And then actually, well, what happened when all of those people decided actually this wasn't a good thing and we're going to tell Twitter about it? Like, I'm sure that their PR team did not want to deal with that. But beyond a PR team, it's about building inclusive products. You don't want your customers saying, "I'm never going to use your product again because you've done something I find massively offensive."
Yeah.
I'm sure that piece of code wasn't reviewed by Jack Dorsey before it went out, but boy, he had to do something about it because it came all the way up to his desk at the very end of it. And this is not what we want to see happening. So in terms of fintech, ultimately, we've seen lots of movements in technology and I suppose more broadly in society. For example, there was Black Pound Day. So many small businesses out there are run by the Black community. How many of those are included in products? How many of those are shipped to them? How are we thinking about building products for different users? Ultimately, my advice really, and this is a really long-winded way of saying it, is get a diverse set of people around the table when you're building these things. A lot of these issues can be solved if you just take enough time to listen to people.
Somebody's individual perspective that's different to your own can help just bust that unconscious bias in the team. But also, I guess, in customer testing, it's quite tempting to produce a focus group or a small panel, and there's only so big that panel can be, or with surveys, just outsource that to a survey recruitment firm. But actually, it could be a real stitch in time just thinking that through. Otherwise, as you say, the risk is you end up in that Jack Dorsey PR nightmare issue, and people were just trying to ship quickly, and these tiny adjustments could have made such an outsized difference to the quality of product.
Yeah, like that issue, and don't get me wrong, the product was bad because ultimately a large proportion of society couldn't use it.
Yeah.
But that issue in terms of how it blew up could have literally been solved in a tweet.
Mm-hmm.
If someone had just tweeted, "We are testing this out. We know it doesn't work for everybody. Bear with us while we try and see how we can build a feature in order to make it happen." Now, could that have been spotted? Probably, if you have the right inclusive processes in your design. This isn't a Twitter bash. I mean, I think every tech company has been liable of doing something like this, and moving forwards. And in a way, we've seen these things pop up just because of the power of social media. But I did a talk at HSBC last year, and actually we were talking about, well, how diverse are the data sets? If we're building, for example, financial fraud models, well, how diverse are they? And has anyone actually even asked that question? What's this built on? Like, what does that mean? Like, if you're transferring a large proportion of capital between particular places, that might just be because that's how your business works, or because you have family in a particular country or location. Like, does your data set build that into account? Or does that mean you're going to hound users all the time for sending money to X and Y country?
Yeah, there is definitely a thing in banking where it has this view of what is a high risk country, but not what is a high risk person and what is high risk for their context and who they are. So it tends to be, well, anybody sending money to that country is high risk. And it's like, well, no, maybe it's not. This is just somebody who every month they send some money back home to look after their family. That's not a high risk activity. That's a perfectly normal activity. Why are you doing that? Oh, well, because it's in that country. That is inherently exclusive. And thinking and just being mature about those processes inside of a bank or a fintech could make a real difference.
Yeah,
I want to ask you.
Because ultimately, it just
Sorry, go.
annoys people. Like
Yeah.
if that keeps happening, I just don't want to go and do that. Like I am a small business owner. I am annoyed about the bank that I use. I am actively looking at which one to transfer to. I'll take my money with me. That's what we do.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we see this tech wave coming, we see hopefully increasing inclusion and diversity in that. That's becoming a bigger and bigger market that the companies that aren't designing that way are now missing out on and having a serious loss as a result. Coronavirus, we talked a little bit about the pandemic, but it also, as a virus, disproportionately affected people from the various BAME communities, people of color, in many different ways. Do you think that's actually going to change career choices and entry into the tech world? Do you think that could have an impact at all?
I don't think it will have, well, there's a few ways. So it can have a negative impact if employers don't recognize that and try and tell people to come into the office when they don't need to, and when they're not necessarily thinking sensibly about, well, who are they actually asking to come into the office and why people actually might not do so. Actually, I think in most places in the world of white collar jobs, I think the adverse impact of coronavirus is actually there's just more talent available. There's ability to work remotely and more flexibly, and actually that's what's going to impact. So in a way, I actually see it as there is the opportunity for more talent from diverse backgrounds to get involved than ever before. Because actually there is an imperative to actually, well, now we don't have to be stuck to the geography of where we're located. We can find the best talent, whether that's in India or South Africa or Nigeria or the UK. And actually, well, sorry, but if you're in Nigeria, you're basically on the same time zone as London or Ghana. So like, why does it matter? Like we can have Zoom calls. So actually, I think the impact from that perspective is actually a growth of the available labour pool and probably therefore a suppression in wages, unfortunately.
It's interesting. I don't know if you've seen the website letsdeal.com. Deal is a startup that really does localized contracts and international payroll. There are startups now appearing that help tech companies deal with payroll on a global basis as if somebody was local and national. There is suddenly hundreds of millions more people available, 100 millions more talented people that are on your time zone, as you say. And now the tools are being built to make that digital and to make that real time. So it will be interesting to see if the companies pick that up. Let's hope that they do. Another question here from Bianca, which is, Jess, why is Black Tech Fest so important right now? She's thinking of ridiculous statements from the ones like Charles Scharf saying that there are not enough qualified minority talent. Can you tell us more about C Code?
Yeah, well, I mean that comment was definitely well, just one, highly offensive. I laugh because I just can't believe that came up. I just laugh in jest of it. And ultimately, so for those who don't know, we run a virtual festival. It's called Black Tech Fest. We have 13 CEOs, 11 VPs, directors, 9 investors, and we've got everyone from Nicholas Enstrom at Atomico, Saul Klein from Local Globe, and Robin as well, actually, and Czech Warner from Ada Ventures. We've got a massive number of organisations involved, and so I would employ everyone to check it out. That's my little pitch. But ultimately, why is it important? Well, we're trying to have a conversation about diversity and inclusion in tech, but I don't want to be on panels where people are like, okay, well, we need another black person on stage. Let's get a black person on stage talking about we need to be a black person on stage. I've been there, done that, got the t-shirt for that. What I want to do is actually have great diverse people from the industries on stage talk about what they get paid to do. And actually, let's talk about product, let's talk about brand, let's talk about technology, let's talk about investing in diverse founders. But frankly, let me have on the panel the people who are actually doing it. Do you know what I mean? Let me have the partners from all these VCs actually who have taken the money out of their pockets and have employed people to go about and do that. So let's have the managing partners. And that's why it's super important, because ultimately, for those, and we have had pushback, for those people who still don't understand why we exist or why we do what we do, this is a showcase for actually just diversity in tech. Ultimately, if you don't see the benefits of diversity in tech or talking about it, well, here's just a diverse panel of people doing different things. And it doesn't actually matter if you're black or white in that sense. We just want people having interesting conversations. But the aim is to showcase great black people doing things which otherwise don't get the platform to do that. So that's kind of why we're doing what we're doing. And ultimately, we want to change the narrative. We want to celebrate. We want to inspire. We want to have conversations in a way that people wouldn't. Because ultimately, if I'm not doing this, who's doing it? Like, we need to do something about this. We need to showcase people. And, I'm fed up of, like, as I said, like, just being that person on that panel again and see you next year. Like, let me do something
Yeah.
different.
Yeah, no, like the more we can show just the good work of people and demonstrate their actual expertise, the more we normalize that, hopefully, and it just becomes that becomes something that everybody can just accept, but also people can role model themselves on, and we just get a long tail of benefits that come off the back of that.
Exactly. So to that comment from the CEO of Wells Fargo, it's like, well, to be honest, he probably didn't have the talent in order to find them because I found them and I've put them on my conference.
Yeah.
So, like, I just firmly refute that. Like, I call it lazy recruitment.
Yeah, and here hopefully we can change that, and the whole industry can, and tech and fintech can be a big part of that. A couple of last questions before I let you go, conscious of the time. There's a good question from Tope here, who's a fin crime specialist at Curve. What would be your top tips to getting started if you feel you have a great idea that supports the advancement of needs and needs to be out there?
So our starting point with Colorintech is we never do anything alone. We always work in partnership with people because there are always things that people can do to help you. So we meet so many entrepreneurs, product builders who are doing heads down, let's like build something, let's come out of it. And then 6 months time, I'm going to show the world and everyone's going to love it. Like, maybe your MVP just needs to be working with somebody to get something going.
Yeah.
And you can probably be a lot quicker and a bit more tactful doing that. And you know what? You build the community, the network, awareness of who you are, what you're doing, you get the introductions to the right people, and that probably accelerate your journey further on. So yeah, my first thing would probably be to think, okay, well, who can I collaborate with? Who's got resources, whether it's people, time, human capital, financial capital, resources, products, technology that we can work with to make this happen, and how can we get going on that as quickly as possible? Because you bring people along with you, ultimately that will be your proof of your pudding in your business. If people don't want to work with you, if people don't want to work for you, if people don't want to invest with you, then that's a lot of negative signals to your idea.
And there's nothing quite like pull from a user and a product in the real world that kind of makes the rubber hit the road. If you're not embarrassed when you ship too late. But as you mentioned earlier, there is that tension of, but make sure you're just not doing the silly things that will end up in the press or some bad thing later on.
And there's embarrassed and there's just shipping bad products which annoy your customers.
Yeah, which is never good business, is it?
No.
Look, a couple of questions to finish up with. Sort of what advice do you have for graduates who are struggling to find a job in tech right now? It's the weirdest job market ever. We've had people just leave university going into this market. What advice have you got?
Yeah, so I mean, my first one would be a plug. Sign up to Black Tech Fest. The reason is one of our partners, TikTok, are literally fast tracking anybody who attends through their application process.
Wow.
So if you're interested in that, exactly, massive. So therefore, do that. What would my broad general advice to be? I always say this to all the young people that I work with: network. Like.
Mm-hmm.
Until we can break some of the systemic problems that happen in society, and believe me, I'm working on it, we need to build our own community and build our networks. And when I say that, I mean that on an individual level. My previous questions, like who can you work with? Who is it that you can have a conversation with that might open a door that you can't open yourself? And ultimately, how do you do that? And well, okay, so how do I go about networking? Well, be interesting. Find an interesting topic. The great thing about technology is, whether it's Twitter, Reddit, 4chan, you name it, you can find someone who's interested in what you are interested in. Obviously, try and think about it on a professional level and start networking with them. Like, reach out, go for coffee, virtual coffee, let's have a chat, let's see who can introduce you to who.
Phenomenal bit of advice. I got into fintech by responding to people on Twitter and sort of commenting on their blogs and just being interested before trying to be interesting. And then lo and behold, they were able to start opening doors. And no question, and I try and recognize it as much as possible, white male privilege definitely helped me out in that process. But absolutely, networking has been key too. And there is no downsides to having more great people in your network. So great advice. Sorry, if you want to continue there, and I was just going to ask you one last question.
Yeah, one last question. I'll just be quick. There's also blackmail privilege in the sense of probably now more than ever, people are very receptive to hearing from minority voices. So use that as a conversation starter.
Absolutely do. So as you on that point, actually, as you look to the future, what are your hopes for tech and society more broadly as we go towards 2021?
So there's a couple of things. So one of my concerns is that this all dissipates out, and in 2 years' time, you say, "Oh, that was a flash in the pan," and everyone feels good because they've patted themselves on the back, and we go back to kind of where we were back in 2019. That's my fear. My optimism is that actually a lot of organizations, people have made systemic change. And when I say that, we're seeing capital be deployed, we're seeing people be hired, we're seeing processes be changed. And ultimately, those are really hard to erode over the sense of apathy that we see happens with all sorts of movements, all sorts of times. So actually, it's the systemic things that I think will go there. As I said, organizations have committed to this, for long term, multiple years, multiple kind of commitments. And I think that ultimately for 2021, I'd love there to be a coronavirus vaccine. I'd love us to be able to go and mingle and meet people again, and ultimately really just seize on the wave of like, we will be in a very exciting world once we get past COVID. And what a great place to be in. Google colorintech.org, or other search engines are available. And well, yeah, they're available. I wouldn't suggest using them. And blacktechfest.com. So yeah, that's where you can find us. I'm also on Twitter, and all the other social media you can imagine, even TikTok probably from next week.